He was on his knees. Kim Jae-won, the most feared man in Seoul, was on his knees on his own marble floor, in his own mansion, in front of his own staff, and not a single person in that room had the courage to breathe. 12 armed bodyguards stood frozen along the walls. 3 senior lieutenants, men who had watched their boss walk into the most dangerous rooms in Korea without adjusting his collar, stood with their mouths slightly open and their hands hanging useless at their sides. 2 housekeepers had stopped mid-step, one still holding a folded towel, the other gripping a tray with both hands like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Every single person in that East Wing was staring at the same impossible image and arriving at the same impossible conclusion. This was not happening. And yet there it was. Undeniable. Unraveling. Kim Jae-won's palms pressed flat against the cold marble floor, his jaw trembling, his broad shoulders curved inward for the first time in living memory. A man who had built an empire on the architecture of fear, reduced in a single moment to something raw and unrecognizable. And the thing that had done it was not a weapon. It was not a rival, not a threat, not the culmination of some long and bloody power struggle. It was a 4-year-old boy. The boy stood less than 2 feet away from him, small and barefoot on the same cold marble, his enormous dark eyes moving slowly across the boss's face with an expression of pure, weaponized innocence. He was not afraid. He had no framework for fear in this moment. He was 4 years old, and the world still made a particular kind of sense to him, a sense in which adults were simply large, confused people who occasionally needed to be asked the right question. He tilted his head to the left. "Why are you crying?" The lieutenant closest to the door, a man named Choi who had personally witnessed 11 executions without flinching, took one slow step backward and said absolutely nothing. Because sliding down the sharp ridge of Kim Jae-won's cheekbone, silent and unstoppable, was a single tear. His hands were pressed so hard into the marble that his knuckles had gone white. His chest was rising and falling with the slow, controlled breathing of a man fighting something enormous that had decided, after years of waiting, that today was the day it was going to win. Nobody in that room had a name for what they were seeing. It didn't exist in the vocabulary of the world they lived in. Men like Kim Jae-won did not kneel. Men like Kim Jae-won did not tremble. Men like Kim Jae-won did not get undone by anything, and certainly not by a child in small socks looking up at them with curious eyes. But here is what none of them understood. Here is what none of them could have possibly understood, standing in that marble hall with their weapons and their silence and their collective shock. They were only seeing the ending. They had no idea what it cost to arrive here. They didn't know about the woman standing 10 feet away with both hands pressed over her mouth and tears falling silently and rapidly down her face. A woman who had spent 5 years hiding in this very mansion, working these very corridors, carrying a specific terror in her chest every single day that this exact moment would eventually find her. They didn't know about the small, worn photograph she had kept in the pocket of her uniform for 5 years without a single day's interruption. They didn't know what that photograph meant. They didn't know what she had sacrificed to keep her secret. They didn't know what she had survived before she ever set foot inside these walls. And they had absolutely no idea that the little boy standing in front of Kim Jae-won, asking him with complete calm why he was crying, as if it were the most natural question in the world, was the answer to something the boss had buried so deep inside himself, he had almost convinced his own soul it no longer existed. That boy was the reason the most feared man in Seoul had forgotten how to stand up. But to understand why Kim Jae-won ended up on his knees, you have to go back. All the way back. You have to understand who he was before the empire and the fear and the marble floors. You have to find the version of him that existed before the name meant something dangerous, when he was simply a young man, far from everything he knew, in a country that had no reason to remember him, meeting a woman that he had absolutely no business falling in love with. And you have to understand, Amara, before this story goes any further, if something in your chest has already shifted, if you can already feel the weight of what is coming, go right now and hit that subscribe button. Turn on your notification bell. Tap that like. It takes 1 second, and it tells this story it deserves to be heard. Because what you just saw, that man on his knees, that is only the surface. What is buried underneath, it will completely break you open. Stay here. Do not go anywhere. 5 years before that marble floor moment, Amara Mensah arrived at the Kim household carrying one suitcase, one letter of employment, and the kind of stillness that only comes from having already survived the worst version of your life. She was 26. Ghanaian. She had the kind of quiet that filled a room without making a sound, a presence that was felt rather than announced, deep and patient, and carefully maintained. Her eyes were large and dark and took in everything around her while offering almost nothing back. She walked softly. She answered only what was asked. She completed every task with a precision that went quietly unnoticed by everyone except the head housekeeper, Mrs. Park, who registered it privately and filed it away without comment. Amara was not trying to impress anyone. She was trying to disappear. The Kim mansion employed 32 staff members. Housekeeping, kitchen, maintenance, security, personal attendants. Amara had been placed in general housekeeping, the outer wings, the lower corridors, the rooms that existed primarily to be cleaned rather than occupied. She was useful. She was forgettable. She was exactly where she needed to be. What nobody knew, what she had taken extreme, almost obsessive care to conceal from the moment she signed her employment papers, was that she had not come alone. In the corner of her small staff room, tucked behind the narrow bed with a careful arrangement of soft toys standing guard around him, was a 3-year-old boy named Kofi. He had her eyes. He had her quietness most of the time, a calm, watchful stillness unusual in a child so young, the kind of stillness that made adults look twice and then look away, uncertain what they had just seen. He could sit for long, uninterrupted stretches watching the thin column of light that came through the high window, his small brow creased with the serious expression of someone solving a problem nobody else could see. But he also had a laugh that arrived like something being unlocked. And questions, relentless, beautiful, fully committed questions, about everything that moved and everything that didn't, about why the sky changed color and why some people walked fast, and whether the moon was tired at night or just resting. Amara had brought him here against every instinct she possessed. She had no choice. No family available. No money for alternatives. No one. So she had negotiated carefully through back channels, paid extra for silence from the placement agency, and constructed a daily routine built entirely around his invisibility. Before 5 every morning, she settled him with his toys and his books, and she gave him his rules in a voice that was gentle but absolute. Never go near the big man, she said. The one at the front of the house. The one everyone goes quiet around. You understand me, Kofi? Never. Not for any reason. Kofi would nod with the gravity of someone accepting a sacred responsibility. For over a year, he kept that promise. But Kofi was almost 4 now. And 4-year-old boys, no matter how serious, no matter how loved, no matter how carefully they have been instructed, are still 4-year-old boys. And 4-year-old boys are constitutionally incapable of leaving a forbidden door unopened forever. The morning that fractured everything began unremarkably. Gray soul light pressing against the windows. Kitchen staff starting their 5 a.m. preparations. Security rotation at the gate. The low professional hum of a household already in motion. And in the small staff room at the rear of the property, for the first time in over a year, Amara overslept. 20 minutes. Just 20 minutes, stolen by exhaustion after a double shift that had left her body wrung dry. In those 20 minutes, Kofi woke up, found his mother still breathing slow and deep with her eyes closed, decided this was an extraordinary development worth investigating, and quietly, methodically, with tremendous 4-year-old intention, began to move toward the sounds he had been hearing from the upper floors for months. He was not being disobedient. In his mind, he was simply following the current that had been pulling at him since the first time he heard footsteps moving above his ceiling with the heavy, certain rhythm of someone important. He wanted to see. He slipped through the service corridor, past the supply closet, past the door marked private in 2 languages, through the connecting passage that he was precisely small enough to navigate before the sensor could register him. And then suddenly, he was somewhere entirely different. Marble floors cold through his socks. Ceilings so high they made him feel small in a new way. Art on the walls that he stopped to examine with his head tilted. A silence that had texture. And at the far end of the corridor, just turning away from a window, a very tall man. 3 guards saw the child at almost exactly the moment the child saw the man. Their voices came low and urgent. Stop. How did he? Get him out now. Kofi did not move. He stood completely still on the cold marble, his head tilting slightly, And he looked at Kim Jo-won the way children look at something they're trying to match to a memory. Searching, comparing, arriving at a conclusion with the slow, certain confidence of a mind that has not yet learned to doubt itself. Then, soft and clear and utterly devastating. Why do you look like the man in my mummy's picture? Everything stopped. Kim Jae-won turned. And the look on his face, the specific, unguarded, catastrophic look that crossed the features of the most feared man in Seoul in that single unprotected second, was something none of the people in that corridor would ever be able to fully describe afterward. It was not anger. It was not confusion. It was something that moved too fast and too deep for either of those words. It looked, more than anything else, like recognition. The guards exchanged a glance. Lieutenant Choi's hand moved instinctively toward his earpiece, and then stopped. Kim Jae-won did not speak immediately. He looked at the boy for a long, suspended moment. At those eyes, at that face, at the specific and devastating arrangement of features that was doing something to him that no threat, no rival, no loss had ever managed to do. Then, very quietly, in a voice none of them had ever heard from him before. What picture? What picture? The two words landed in the corridor like something dropped from a great height. Soft but heavy, quiet but absolute. And the boy, unbothered, unafraid, with the magnificent fearlessness of someone who has not yet learned that some questions cost everything, simply looked up at the tall man and answered. The one mummy keeps in her pocket. She looks at it when she thinks I'm sleeping. Another silence. Deeper this time. Lieutenant Choi had stopped breathing entirely. The two guards flanking the corridor entrance had gone so still, they had essentially become furniture. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because something was happening on Kim Jae-won's face that none of them had a reference point for. A slow, internal earthquake moving behind his eyes, contained and enormous and completely unlike anything they had ever seen from him. He crouched down. Not to intimidate. Not to interrogate. He crouched down the way a man crouches when he suddenly needs to be at eye level with something, when the ground feels unstable and getting lower feels like the only sensible response. He looked at the boy's face. Up close, it was worse. Up close, the specifics of it, the shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw, the particular way the boy held his chin slightly elevated with a dignity that should not have been possible on a face that young. All of it assembled into something that hit Kim Jae-won like a closed fist pressing slowly through his sternum. What is your name? He asked. Kofi, the boy said. Then, with the automatic politeness of a child well raised, what is yours? The ghost of something crossed the boss's face. Not quite a smile. Something older and more painful than a smile. Jae-won, he said. Kofi considered this with appropriate seriousness. That's a long name. And in the most unlikely moment, in the most unlikely room, with 12 armed men watching in collective suspended disbelief, Kim Jae-won made a sound that might, under different circumstances and in a different life, have been a laugh. Short, involuntary, gone almost before it arrived. Then his face closed again, and he stood, and he turned to Lieutenant Choi with eyes that had shifted into something unreadable and said 4 words in a tone that brooked absolutely nothing. Bring me her. Now. Amara woke to the sound of her door opening. Not Kofi. The footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate, too multiple. She was upright before she was fully conscious, her heart slamming against the inside of her ribs with the specific, primal terror of a mother who reaches for her child and finds empty air. Kofi was gone. 2 guards stood in her doorway. Behind them, Mrs. Park with an expression that was equal parts apology and helplessness. One of the guards spoke in careful, accented English. Mr. Kim wants to see you. Now. Amara did not move immediately. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at them, and she felt the entire architecture of the last 5 years begin to crack simultaneously. Every careful precaution, every practiced invisibility, every morning of quiet discipline, and every night of controlled fear, cracking all at once under the weight of the thing she had always known was waiting for her. My son, she said. Her voice was steady. She had trained it to be steady even when everything else was not. Where's my son? He is safe, Mrs. Park said quickly. He is unharmed. Amara, go. Do not make them wait. She stood. She straightened her uniform. And then, without thinking, from pure muscle memory built over 5 years, her hand moved to the pocket at her hip. Her fingers found the small rectangle of worn paper and pressed against it once, hard, the way a person presses a bruise to confirm it is still real. Then she followed the guards out. The walk to the east wing felt like moving through water. The corridors that Amara had spent 5 years navigating with her eyes down and her presence minimized now felt impossibly long, impossibly exposed. Each step carrying her towards something she had spent 5 years rehearsing and dreading in equal measure. The staff they passed in the hallways did not look at her directly. That told her everything about how fast word had traveled. They knew something was happening. They just didn't know what. Amara knew. She had always known this day had a shape. She just hadn't known what it would feel like to walk toward it on her own 2 feet. They brought her to the main reception hall, a room she had cleaned 100 times, but never stood in as anything other than a ghost with a polishing cloth. It looked different when you were standing in the center of it. Larger, more deliberate. The kind of room designed to make everyone inside it aware of the specific distance between themselves and power. Kofi was there. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor near the far wall, examining something small with focused concentration. A button, she realized. Just a button he had found on the floor somewhere. Her chest contracted so sharply it physically hurt. He looked up when she entered, and his face broke into the full, unguarded brightness of a child who has had an adventure and cannot wait to report it. Mummy, I met a man. His name is J1. It's very long. I know, baby, she said. Her voice broke on the second word. She locked it back down. Come here. He came to her immediately, climbing to his feet and crossing the room in his small socks, and she put her hand on top of his head and held it there and looked up. Kim J1 was standing at the window. He had his back to the room. His hands were clasped behind him. He was utterly still in the way of a man who has made himself go still deliberately, not calm, but controlled. There was a difference. She knew that difference better than anyone. The guards were positioned at the doors. Lieutenant Choi stood to the left. Nobody spoke. Then Kim J1 turned around. And for the first time in 5 years, Amara Minsa and Kim J1 were in the same room, looking directly at each other. It lasted for seconds, maybe 5. Long enough for everything buried between them to rise to the surface all at once. Every unsaid word, every year of silence, every unanswered prayer, every night she had looked at a photograph and had a conversation with a man who wasn't there. His jaw tightened. He looked at the boy. He looked back at her. How old is he? Amara's hand pressed tighter against Kofi's head. 3, she said. He turns 4 next month. Something moved through Kim J1's eyes. Fast. Devastatingly fast. Show me, he said quietly. Show me the photograph. The room tightened. Amara did not move for a moment. She stood completely still, her hand on her son's head, and she looked at the man across the room with eyes that held 5 years of everything. Waiting and grief and survival, and a love she had never once allowed herself to speak out loud in this building. Then slowly, she reached into her pocket. The photograph was small and worn soft at the edges from years of handling. She crossed the room and held it out. He took it. And the moment his eyes dropped to it, the control he had been maintaining, the careful, architectural stillness of a man who rules by never letting anything touch him, began visibly, unmistakably, to come apart. The photograph showed 2 people. A younger version of Kim J1, his face unguarded and open in a way that bore almost no resemblance to the man standing in this room. Laughing at something off camera, his arm around a young woman who was looking not at the camera but at him, with an expression of such complete and undefended feeling that it was almost painful to witness even in a photograph. The young woman was Amara. They were standing in front of a small building with a corrugated iron roof. Behind them, the wide flat expanse of a landscape that was not Seoul, was not Korea, was not anywhere near either of those things. They were in Ghana. Kim J1's hand was trembling. Not slightly, not subtly. His hand was trembling with the specific, uncontrollable tremor of a man whose body has encountered something his mind is not yet prepared to fully process. A piece of evidence that confirms what he has spent years refusing to investigate. He stared at the photograph for a long time. Long enough for Lieutenant Choi to exchange a single glance with the guard at the door and then immediately look away, as if he had accidentally witnessed something sacred. Then Kim J1 looked up at Amara. When I left, he started. You said you would come back, she said. 3 words. Quiet. Not accusatory. Not angry. Just true. in the way that only the simplest statements can be true, stripped of everything except their bare, essential fact. "You said you would come back," she said again. "And I waited. I waited for a long time, Jae-won." The sound of his name in her voice, his actual name, not his title, not his surname, not the name that meant something dangerous, did something to the air in the room. Several of the guards found reasons to look at the floor. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't know," she said. And there was something in her voice now that was worse than anger, a tiredness so deep it had become its own kind of peace. "That is the part that took me the longest to accept. That you simply didn't know." Kofi, who had been listening to this exchange with tremendous 4-year-old attention, looked up at his mother and then across at the tall man, and then back at his mother again, assembling something in his mind with the slow, unstoppable logic of a child who always asks the next question. "Mummy," he said, "is that man my daddy?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing that room had ever contained. Amara closed her eyes. Kim Jae-won looked at the boy, at those eyes, at that face, at the 4-year-old person standing in his reception hall in small socks holding his mother's hand, and something inside him that had been clenched tight for years simply let go all at once, and there was no stopping what came next, and he did not try to stop it. He walked toward them, slowly, and then he stopped, and then, in front of every guard, every lieutenant, every witness in that room, in front of the entire architecture of fear and power and reputation that he had spent his entire adult life constructing, Kim Jae-won went to his knees. Not smoothly, not gracefully. The way a man goes to his knees when his legs simply stop being willing to hold the weight of what he is carrying. He looked up at the boy from the floor. "I didn't know," he said. And his voice, that voice that had given orders resulting in consequences nobody in Seoul wanted to think about, cracked completely down the middle. "I didn't know about you. I didn't know you existed. I am so sorry." Kofi looked at him for a long moment. Then, with the profound and effortless mercy that only the very young are still capable of, he reached out his small hand and placed it flat against Kim Jae-won's cheek. "It's okay," he said simply. "Don't cry." And that was the moment, that small warm hand against his face, that finished what the photograph had started. Kim Jae-won pressed his forehead gently against Kofi's small shoulder, and the last wall came down completely. Lieutenant Choi was staring very hard at a point on the ceiling. Amara stood with both hands over her mouth and tears falling in absolute silence down her face. Not tears of fear, not tears of relief, tears of something that had no clean name. The complicated, exhausted, grief-soaked release of a woman who had carried an impossible weight for 5 years and had just, for the first time, felt someone reach out and take part of it. But the story was not finished. Not yet. Because there was still something Amara had not told him. Something she had kept back even now, even in this moment. A part of the story that the photograph could not show and that Kofi's existence alone could not explain. Something that had happened after Jae-won left Africa. Something that had made the waiting so much harder than simply waiting. Something he needed to know. And she was not sure she was ready to say it out loud. Not yet. If you are still here, if this story has its hand around your heart and you are not ready to let go, hit that subscribe button right now and tap that like. Because what Amara has been hiding, the part of this story that goes beyond a photograph and a child and a man on his knees, is coming in the final chapter. And it will change everything you think you already understand about these two people. Stay here. The best part is next. The room had begun to breathe again. Slowly, carefully, the way a room breathes after something seismic has passed through it and left everything rearranged. The guards had not moved from their positions, but their quality of stillness had shifted, no longer the rigid attention of men awaiting a command, but the quiet, almost reverent stillness of people who have accidentally witnessed something they will spend the rest of their lives thinking about and never fully discussing. Lieutenant Choi had found his way back to his own face. Mrs. Park, who had appeared silently at the side door at some point during the last few minutes, was pressing the folded towel she still carried against her mouth with both hands. Kim Jae-won had risen from the floor. Not quickly, not with the swift, controlled movements that characterized everything he did in this house. He rose slowly, with the careful heaviness of a man reassembling himself piece by piece, reclaiming his height and his bearing, while something fundamental about him had permanently and irrevocably changed. He was still the same man, and he was absolutely not the same man. Both of those things were equally true, and everyone in the room could feel it. Kofi had returned to his button. He was sitting on the marble floor a few feet away, turning the small disc over and over in his fingers with dedicated concentration. Already moved on from the emotional devastation he had just casually caused, the way only children can move on, completely, guiltlessly, into the next present moment. Kim Jae-won looked at Amara. She was standing with her arms wrapped around herself, not defensively, but the way a person holds themselves together when they are managing several enormous feelings simultaneously and cannot afford to put any of them down. Her eyes were dry now. She had pulled herself back from the edge of whatever was threatening to overwhelm her, and she was watching him with that deep, patient, unreadable expression he remembered. He had thought about that expression more times than he would ever say out loud. "Sit down," he said, not as a command, as something closer to a request, which, from him, was significant enough that Lieutenant Choi registered it and filed it away in silence. Amara sat. He sat across from her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the space between them was filled with 5 years of everything that had never been said. Then Kim Jae-won leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, and he looked at her with an expression that had nothing performative in it. No authority, no distance, none of the careful architecture of the man who ran this house and this empire. Just a man, looking at a woman, trying to find the beginning of a conversation that should have happened years ago. "Tell me," he said quietly. "All of it. From the beginning." Amara looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked at Kofi, still absorbed in his button on the floor. And then she looked at Jae-won, and she took a breath that carried the weight of 5 years inside it, and she began. She had stayed in Ghana for 8 months after he left. 8 months of waiting with the specific, disciplined hope of a woman who has been given a promise by someone she trusts completely. She had checked her phone every morning before she was fully awake. She had explained his absence to the few people in her life who asked questions with a calm certainty that he was coming back, because she believed it. She had believed it the way she believed in things she could not see but knew were real. She had no reason not to. He had looked her in the eyes when he said it. He had held her face in his hands. She had felt the truth of it move through her like something settled and permanent. Then 2 months after he left, she discovered she was pregnant. Something shifted in Kim Jae-won's face. He did not speak. He simply looked at her and listened, and his jaw was tight with something she recognized now as the specific pain of understanding. Finally, fully, what his absence had actually cost. She had tried to reach him. She wanted him to know that part clearly. She had tried through every channel available to her. The number he had given her, which went unanswered for 3 weeks, and then disconnected entirely. The contact she had for his associate, who responded once with a message that said only that Jae-won had returned to Korea and was unreachable. She had written a letter. She was not certain it ever arrived. She had no way of knowing. She waited 4 more months after Kofi was born. Waiting with a baby now, which is a different kind of waiting entirely. Heavier, more urgent, cut through constantly with the practical demands of a new life that needed feeding and holding and watching over. She waited until the waiting started to feel like something she was doing to herself rather than something she was doing for anyone else. Then she stopped. She did not stop loving him. She wanted to say that clearly, and she did say it, looking directly at him without flinching. She stopped waiting, which is a different thing. She made a decision to build something, to survive something, to take her son and move forward into whatever life was available to them, with or without the man in the photograph. She had found employment through an international domestic placement agency. She had taken whatever was offered. What was offered, eventually, was a position in Seoul. She had not known whose household it was when she accepted. That was the truth, and she needed him to understand it was the truth. She had been assigned, processed, transported, and delivered to this address before she understood what name was on the gate. And by then she had no money to refuse, no alternative to return to, and a 3-year-old boy who needed to eat. So she stayed. She kept her head down. She made herself invisible. She told herself every day that the mansion was large enough, that the boss was remote enough, that if she was careful enough, she could exist in the margins of this world without ever being seen by the one person she could not afford to be seen by. And for over a year, it had worked. Kim Jae-won had been quiet throughout all of this. Completely, absolutely quiet. The kind of quiet that is not passive but actively consuming. taking in every word and holding it, and feeling the full weight of it without deflection or defense. When she finished, the silence stretched between them for a long moment. Then he said, and his voice had a texture it had never carried in this house before, rough and low and stripped of everything except its bare meaning. I tried to come back. Amara looked at him. There was a situation. He stopped. Started again. When I returned to Korea, there was a war. Inside the organization. My father. Things had collapsed while I was away. There were people who wanted me dead. There were weeks where I wasn't certain I would survive them. He paused. The number I had given you was a phone that was destroyed in the first week. I had no way to reach you. I had no way to reach anyone outside of what was immediately in front of me. He looked at his hands. And by the time I survived it, by the time I had enough control to think beyond the next hour, enough time had passed that I told myself it was too late. That going back would be dangerous for you. That the kindest thing I could do was stay away. His jaw worked. I told myself that so many times that I eventually stopped questioning whether it was true or whether it was just easier than facing what I had walked away from. The honesty of it landed in the room like something fragile set down very gently. Amara looked at him for a long time. And the expression on her face was not what he deserved, and they both knew it. It was not anger, not condemnation, not the righteous fury of a woman owed an enormous debt. It was something quieter and in many ways more devastating. It was understanding. I know, she said simply. I think I always knew there was a reason. That helped, sometimes. And sometimes it made it worse. She looked at Kofi. He has your stillness, she said quietly. When he is thinking about something. That particular stillness. I noticed it when he was very small, and I didn't know what to do with it. Kim Jae-won looked at his son. His son. The word had no precedent in him. He had no internal room built for it. No framework. No rehearsed response. It simply landed in the center of him and expanded slowly outward and changed the shape of everything it touched. Kofi chose this precise moment to look up from his button and find both adults staring at him. He looked at one, then the other, with the alert expression of a child who senses he is the subject of a conversation and is deciding whether this is good or bad. Then he held up the button. I found this, he announced with complete gravity. It is mine now. And Amara laughed. It came out suddenly, through tears she hadn't realized were falling again. A real laugh. Unguarded and briefly helpless. The laugh of a woman who has been carrying something crushing for 5 years and has just felt it shift off her shoulders by an inch. Just an inch. But an inch was enough to breathe. Kim Jae-won looked at her laughing, and something settled in his face. Something permanent. Something that had made its decision and was done deliberating. He stood, crossed to where Kofi was sitting on the floor and crouched down in front of him. And this time the crouching was different. Not the crouching of a man whose legs have given out, but the deliberate, chosen lowering of someone who wants to be at eye level. Who is choosing to be small enough to be met. That is a good button, he said seriously. Kofi examined him. Do you want to see it? Yes. The boy placed it carefully in Kim Jae-won's open palm with the solemnity of someone transferring something of genuine value. The boss turned it over once, examined it with appropriate gravity, and handed it back. Very good button, he confirmed. Kofi nodded, satisfied. Then, with the sudden, total physical trust of a child whose body decides before his mind does, he leaned sideways and rested his head against Kim Jae-won's arm. The boss went completely still, as if any movement might break something. As if the small warm weight against his arm was the most precious and terrifying thing he had ever been trusted with. Lieutenant Choi turned and walked quietly out of the room. Nobody stopped him. Nobody blamed him. What happened in the weeks that followed the Kim household did not fully understand and did not dare question. The boss changed. Not in ways that made him less effective. Not in ways that weakened the organization or loosened the iron discipline that kept everything running. But in ways that were quieter and more fundamental. In the texture of how he moved through the house. In the particular attention he gave to certain rooms that he had previously walked through without seeing. He moved Amara out of the staff quarters. Not to the main house immediately. He understood that required time, required conversation, required the slow and careful rebuilding of something that had been interrupted and damaged and would not be rushed. But he moved her and Kofi to the guest wing, to rooms that had light and space and a garden view that Kofi could press his face against every morning. And he told her directly, and without performance that she would never clean another floor in this house unless she chose to. She looked at him for a long moment when he said that. "I don't need to be rescued," she said. "I know," he said. "That is not what I am offering." "Then what are you offering?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, simply, directly, without the grandiose language of a man trying to compensate for what he had failed to do, he said, "Time. If you will give it to me. Time to show Kofi who I am. Time to show you who I am trying to become. Nothing faster than that." Amara considered this for a long time. Long enough that the silence became something he had to sit inside without fidgeting, without pushing, without filling it with anything except the willingness to wait. Then she said, "Don't make promises you can't keep, J1. "I know the cost of that now," he said. "I won't." It did not happen overnight. The right things rarely do. There were hard conversations. Conversations that lasted past midnight with cold tea between them and years of pain being turned over carefully like something delicate that still had sharp edges. There were days when Amara pulled back into her own space, and he did not follow because she needed him not to follow. There were days when Kofi tested him with the magnificent, creative ferocity of a small boy who is subconsciously asking, "Are you going to stay? What happens when I am difficult? What happens when I need too much? Are you the kind of person who stays?" Kim Jae-won stayed. Every time. Without exception. Through the button phases, and the screaming phases, and the 3 a.m. nightmares, and the days when Kofi decided that Jae-won was his absolute favorite person in the world, and the days when he decided with equal conviction that he was his least favorite. He stayed. Consistently, quietly, without making it into something it needed to be celebrated for. He simply showed up. Again and again and again. And slowly, the way seasons change, without announcing themselves, something began to grow in the space between the three of them. Not perfect, not without its complications, but real, rooted, the kind of thing that has weight to it. Amara watched him with her son. She watched the particular quality of attention he gave Kofi, the way he listened to the endless questions without impatience, the way he crouched down to be at eye level, the way he remembered small things Kofi had mentioned days earlier and brought them back into conversation, showing the boy that his words had been heard and kept. She watched a man who had been built entirely around power and fear learning, slowly, imperfectly, genuinely, what it meant to be soft with someone small. One evening she found them both asleep on the couch in the sitting room. Kofi curled against Jae-won's side with one small fist bunched in the fabric of his shirt. Jae-won's head tilted back, one arm loose around the boy, his face, in sleep, unguarded, carrying an expression she had seen once before. In Africa, in a photograph, the face of the man before the empire. She stood in the doorway for a long time. Then she crossed the room quietly and sat beside them, and she looked at the photograph she still carried, the worn, soft-edged rectangle she had kept in her pocket for 5 years, and she looked at the man beside her, and she placed the photograph on the table. She did not put it back in her pocket. She left it on the table, face up, like something that no longer needed to be hidden, like something that had finally arrived at the place it had always been traveling toward. The man who ruled Seoul with silence and fear did not become a different person, but he became a larger one, large enough to contain something other than empire, large enough to let a small boy with enormous questions and a found button climb into the space beside him and stay there. Large enough to look at a woman who had waited and survived and built and carried everything alone and choose, every single day, to be worthy of the waiting. Kofi grew up knowing exactly who he was and exactly who his father was, and holding both of those things with the easy confidence of a child who has never been asked to choose. He grew up with his mother's eyes and his father's stillness and a laugh that filled every room he entered like sunlight through broken glass. He grew up in a house where fear was not the primary language anymore. And the most feared man in Seoul, the man whose name had once made grown men rearrange their lives, learned what it felt like to be undone by something small and warm and completely without agenda. Learned what it felt like to be known by someone who had no use for your reputation and no interest in your power and simply wanted to show you a button they had found on the floor. He learned that this specific, ordinary, irreplaceable thing was the only conquest that had ever actually meant anything. The man who ruled with fear finally learned what it meant to belong. And that is where we leave them. Not at the kneeling, not at the breaking, but here, in the quiet, earned warmth of something rebuilt from honesty and time, and the unstoppable grace of a 4-year-old boy who asked the right question at exactly the right moment. If this story moved something in you, if Amara's waiting, or Kofi's fearlessness, or J1 learning to stay touched any part of you, then please share this video with someone you love right now. Someone who needs to be reminded that the things we think are lost are sometimes simply waiting for us to find our way back. Subscribe and turn on your notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like, it means more than you know. And in the comments, tell me this. Have you ever waited for something, or someone, that finally came back to you? Share your story. This community is built on real feeling, and I want to hear yours. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one.